Thank you for inviting me to join you as we remember those massacred in the prisons in 1988 and demand justice for the dead and their families. I'm here as a solicitor and a human rights defender to express my grave concern and shame at the incapacity of the World Forum to bring the perpetrators of the massacre to account. The United Nations General Assembly more than a decade ago asked the Iranian authorities to investigate current and previous human rights violations. In other words, to investigate itself. And the reality is that the justice system in Iran is part of the apparatus of suppression of human rights defenders. It's been described by Amnesty as legalizing brutality. There's a long catalogue of the floggings, amputations, blindings, and other cruel and inhuman treatment of detained and imprisoned people. This is most recently catalogued in the Amnesty report of last week. The international legal community, of which I am a member, like Kirsty, like Tahar, upholds the rule of law and seeks to ensure that it is upheld in every country in the world. A basic part of the rule of law must be the independence of the judicial system. There is no independence of the judicial system in Iran. On the 26th of June last year, Amnesty International released this statement. The Iranian authorities' ongoing refusal to acknowledge the deaths or to reveal the fate and whereabouts of those forcibly disappeared and killed has placed a cruel burden on family members who continue to be haunted by a sense of anguish, uncertainty, and injustice. There is no doubt that the agonizing suffering inflicted on victims' families for more than 30 years violates the absolute prohibition on torture and other cruel and inhuman treatment under international law. The Iranian regime is incapable of conducting an independent or fair investigation of crimes committed by its own officials. Following extensive research and legal analysis, Amnesty denounced the killings as extrajudicial executions, a significant term from a criminal justice perspective. Amnesty defines extrajudicial execution as the unlawful and deliberate killing of a person carried out by order of a government or with its complicity or acquiescence, and carried out with no pretense of legality. The committees or the death commissions bore no resemblance to a court. They did not operate within existing legislation. They were not concerned with establishing the guilt or innocence of defendants regarding an internationally recognized criminal offense. Prisoners were not informed that they were condemned to death until shortly before their executions. They were not told why they were faced with questions or that their answers could condemn them to death. There was no possibility of appeal at any point during the process. Amnesty International therefore categorized that the mass executions were both summary and extrajudicial in nature and deemed it important to express its legal conclusion that the mass executions constituted crimes under international law in themselves, regardless of whether they form part of a widespread or systematic attack on the civilian population and therefore constituted crimes against humanity. Authoritative sources on international law have consistently used the term extrajudicial execution when making the argument that arbitrary deprivation of life can amount to crimes under international law. And the characterization of the 1988 massacres as extrajudicial executions does not shift criminal responsibility away from members of the judiciary involved in the death commissions. On the contrary, their involvement in these commissions places them under suspicion of criminal responsibility for crimes under international law. Given that there is no prospect for justice for victims of these crimes in Iran, the United Nations must set up an independent investigation into the extrajudicial executions and the enforced disappearances to establish the truth, enable prosecutions of those suspected of responsibility, and ensure that survivors and families of victims receive reparations. The world needs to know the exact number of those killed in 1988, their identities, the date, location, cause, and circumstances of each enforced disappearance and extrajudicial execution, and the location of their remains. Those suspected of responsibility must be prosecuted. The survivors and families of victims must be provided with reparation in accordance with international standards. The Western democracies, and especially the UK, should demand an international inquiry into the massacre and international accountability process in this year's UN resolution on Iran. I share the call on member states of the UN Human Rights Council, again, especially the UK, to mandate a UN inquiry into the widespread and systematic patterns of mass arrests, enforced disappearances, torture, and unfair trials of detainees, as well as the unlawful killings of protesters and bystanders that took place during and in the aftermath of last November's protests. With a view to ensuring accountability and guarantees of non-repetition, Iran must account for these crimes. The victims and their families must have justice. Thank you.